Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. As you mentioned, my name is Mallika, and today I will be speaking about my practice. As an early career filmmaker, part of what motivates my narrative approach is to explore film as language and to think of how images, words, and sounds come together to create meaning. I've always been interested in engaging with images and words, and as a result, my arts practice traverses still and moving image and text. A caveat before I begin is that this is all a work in progress, and the idea of this ongoing process is perhaps evident in the title of my presentation, Filming Language, Thinking Through Image and Text, where I use the present tense precisely because this is something that I'm working through and hope to continue to learn about. So I'll begin with the personal, which is my foray into filmmaking began as a result of enrolling in the creative documentary course, Sri Aurobindo Center for Arts and Communication. I always knew that I wanted to work in the realm of film, but I was uncertain of where and how to begin. Previously, I had studied at the School of Arts and Aesthetics in JNU, and that gave me a grounding in film theory and introduced me to the use of film as language. But at the creative documentary course, as I made films, I discovered that my primary interests were in direction, research, and editing. One of the things that the course also reiterated was this idea that while stories have been told before, it is your own distinct perspective that makes it your own. So the personal becomes a lens in which to think about how I wanted to look at film and language. I remember it was the December of 2017, and I was visiting my paternal grandmother in Chennai. It was a short break before we started working on our diploma films, and I remember that my childhood had consisted of Madras summers visiting my grandmother. But as I grew older, I wanted to continue to try to visit her once a year when I had a holiday. But this time was different because my grandmother had begun her slow decline into dementia. I struggled to have conversations with her because she would forget that I did not speak Tamil. I became conscious of the way that I never made the effort to learn what was her first language. My first language is English. It's really the only language I'm comfortable in. Growing up in Delhi, I had to learn Hindi, but it never felt like I belonged while I was speaking Hindi, and I was often made to feel conscious of that fact. Perhaps because of that, language has been something that is fascinating. It is everywhere around me, but somehow out of reach. To me, language can offer a window into personal worlds and ways of perceiving that are unique to each individual. So my first film, Afterward, which was set in Daryaganj, was an attempt to explore that experience through objects. It didn't start out that way, but I think it became about language and belonging as I worked on it. I had initially wanted to look at Daryaganj as a space because it was famous for its Sunday book bazaar. And growing up, my father would visit frequently, buying books that filled up our house because you could buy them by the kilo. I wanted to look at books and the personal and what that meant to me, thinking through the space and the idea of memory. As an exercise in mapping, my mentors asked me to write a fiction story set in the bazaar and then to map it, again in a different way. When I did the second exercise, I hit upon the way objects occupied space. Because when I visited the same space on a weekday, the bazaar was no longer there, but I came across a sub-registry where typists sat on the pavement. While the words that fill the street on Sunday were those of fantastical or real worlds, of philosophy or murder or romance, on the weekdays, the street was filled with words that were legally binding. By looking at the second-hand book and the typewriter, I wanted to propose a counter-argument to the idea of obsolescence by relooking the idea of value. And here, the form of the film also evolved from the content. While I was doing my research, I was telling my mother about the idea that I had, and she told me about Claude Lévi-Strauss and the way in which he used the term bricolage. So he writes about it in The Savage Mind, and it refers to this process by which the bricklayer or the handyman uses creative ways of putting things together takes creative solutions from the material that is available to them. So I imagine myself as a filmmaker, as the bricklayer. And I try to bring together these two experiences of the same space through an added narrative of the personal that I use through an idea of a letter discovered in a second-hand book. So questions in my research and recce phase also led me to learn about a 100-year-old Urdu book, to read about the history of Delhi. Rajbala, the typist, told me how she typed out Hindi letters, combining signs and symbols to make sense of the text. I thought about the old man I saw outside a metro station, who sat alone and wrote in his notebook. But I never had the courage to ask him what he was writing. So, in the film, the pavement of the city becomes a place for layers of these narratives, where the Hindi typewriter, the Urdu book, and the letter in English tie together to tell a story of parallel lives and languages that coexist. I remember that in a class on narrative that the filmmaker Rajala Shah took with us, a question that came up was, how do you tell a story without words? Since it was my first film, I imagined myself as a writer more than a visual storyteller at that time. And the reliance on words to express what I wanted to say was comforting. But to make a film, one has to make the leap from expressing oneself in words to expressing oneself in images. It's something that I struggled with, and I do continue to struggle with to some extent. But in one of the conversations that I had with my mentor about using text in the film, Samira said, why don't you treat your text as image? And I think that became a defining moment about how I wanted to approach filming language. Words and letters were images and stories and ideas in themselves. This was something that I was thinking about, especially in 2018, where the run-up to the 2019 elections saw us bombarded by hate speech and vitriol in videos that were shared on WhatsApp and other audio-visual hosting platforms. Here, language was being deployed in forms that were contorted and became skewed. And therefore, my second film, Zabaan Par, which I should be screening today, emerged from this unease with the way in which language was becoming a central part of the divisive politics in India today. So here I come to the political, because for me, language was a means of expression. It was a way of viewing the world and engaging with it. But there has been an increasing trend in the politicization and particularly a saffronization of language and the imposition of one kind of history reading and historiography through it. The past few years have seen a homogenization of history and its concomitant erasure in this manner. Some of the questions that have become part of my research was how was this erasure of language linked to erasure of history? Who writes our history? How is it recorded so as to become one of a kind? While language is associated with different kinds of regional and cultural communities, one sees that the mainstream discourse on language has become so polarizing that it acts as a tool and becomes a part of the machinery of divisiveness. So, as part of my early research for the film that I'll be showing today, I began by reading G.N. Devi's work. So, in an essay called The Story of Telling, he writes about storytelling as a transaction between four forces: memory, imagination, language, and the other. So, he begins by talking about how human consciousness is about coming to terms with space and time with the help of two mental faculties. One is memory, and the other is imagination. So, memory helps us to make sense of time, and the imagination makes us helps us to negotiate space. So when language, memory, time, and imagination come together, our consciousness creates a fantasy of the world. And this is the beginning of fiction, he writes. But he adds that there's one more element in this transaction, and that is that fiction must be told. For this, one needs the other. I thought this was really interesting because of the way in which these factors play into our understanding of history and history writing. Devi talks about how these lead to lead to scripts and states threatening of stories. He talks about aphasia, or a loss of speech that returns in an amnesia imposed upon us. He writes, and I quote, "When in such stratified communities, the states and script force a condition of aphasia on speech. And when the territorial rights, identity possibilities, and cultural freedom are taken away, a new condition emerges, for want of a better word, which I shall describe it as anesthesia." So I think this was a fascinating way to describe what an erasure of history could perhaps do to those it seeks to erase. He's tracing the term from its etymology, and I quote, "Aesthesis is the ability to perceive the world through your senses, through touch, sound, taste, sight, the joy of being and the celebration of life," end quote. Can we search for ways to combat this anesthesia or prevent aphasia before it happens? Devi is hopeful. He writes, "Once again, the human consciousness gets around this obstacle. It manages to snap the bind created by science seeking to define it. It challenges scriptures and scripts and recovers the significance lost within science. A story is born." So this led me to wonder, how does the act of storytelling become a political one? With that question in mind, I began to search for images that allowed me to speak of the place of language and the place of language in this context. So part of my research, I attended heritage walks exploring Urdu and the literature in Delhi. I spoke to Suhail Hashmi about what I was interested in, and he told me about calligraphy and the way it was used on monuments. And looking at calligraphy then actually became an easy way to think about text as image, especially because I found this calligrapher who was a pictorial calligrapher and was using both Devanagari and Nastaliq in her work. So when I actually started this film you're about to see, it was supposed to be an observational film where I wanted to show creative ways in which language and scripts and cultures were being transformed through the use of calligraphy. Simultaneously, I was also reading about the history of Urdu in India by referring to C.M. Naim's works, which is the Ambiguities of Heritage, Fictions and Polemics, and Urdu Text and Context, the selected essays of C.M. Naim. I joined an Urdu class to better understand the language that I was reading and researching about, and I also thought of shooting this experience of learning a language as an adult. The shooting of this film was not without its challenges. I dropped my camera, I broke my lens, I had to get that fixed. I shot an interview with 3 scholars where they were talking about the relationship and the politics between Hindi and Urdu, and then somehow I lost the audio for that, so I couldn't use it. Apart from the technical issues, I also struggled with tying together these narratives and thinking about how to put together something that's perhaps disparate in a certain way. So I was struggling with scripting, and one of the earliest things I had been certain about, which was that I was conscious of not wanting this film to be about Urdu as a dying language or exoticizing it or talking about it in a nostalgic way. The aim of making this film came from a place where I was thinking, how does one talk about politics and its divisiveness without having a tendency to dehumanize or to reduce or simplify the complex nature of reality as it exists and as we interact with it? Unfortunately, mid-edit, I realized that to some extent I was doing precisely what I was hoping not to do. And that the argument that I was trying to make against reducing language to one kind or one form, in a way I was reducing it in a different way, to an idealized or to a sort of beautiful version of Urdu. And I realized I needed to find a way to speak about this heterogeneous experience of language, while also underscoring the political context within which I was working. And so the city became the way to do that. The film then became not about calligraphy, but about reading and encountering Urdu in the city in its various forms. Of reading Naim in snatches of time while on my way to Urdu class, or of seeing Urdu on road signs next to Punjabi and English and Hindi, or of a song heard on a bus. Much in the way the city as a space became a protagonist and of sorts in Afterward, I found it offering a multiplicity of signs and symbols and a layering of history. The city offered a way to map the history of this language and its relationship to not just the political but the everyday. To present this film in another city then, with its own language, then becomes an exercise worth exploring. How does language transform again in such a viewing? What are the linkages that it finds in a different geography? The dislocation in viewing this film is, of course, not only of space in the current moment, but of time, because I made this film in 2018. And as I revisit it now, I see certain threads that continue in more insidious ways. Erasure takes new and more legitimate forms. The need for documentation, for fiction, and forms of storytelling become more imperative to do, as do acts of translation. So I hope that once we watch the film, we can also have an informative discussion after the screening. And thank you so much for coming here today. So I began by speaking about the way in which I've been looking at language, that is looking at the 2 films in which language and the idea of image and text play a part in my practice. So these are 2 student films that I had made, and how those started me on a path about thinking about and questioning how we look at language and how we represent language. So I screened my film Zabaan Par, which was around 18 minutes. And after that, we had a short question and answer session where questions asked included my relationship to Urdu and why I chose Urdu in the first place. And also, what is the way in which one thinks about language politically in terms of how we define the history of a language and its relationship to space. So it was a short Q&A session about some of the research that I did and why I made the film. So thank you. Yeah.